A few months ago, I was invited to a birthday party for my wife's friend over in Minneapolis. I was going through a season of anxiety at the time. A season, he says. And sometimes loud parties where I don't know anyone stress me out, so I decided to time a fairly robust cannabis gummy to hit at approximately the moment I got to the doorstep. I remember feeling these delicious reverberations as I tapped the snow off my shoe on the stoop. The perfect crime. When we got in, I grabbed what I thought was sparkling water and posted up in a comfortable chair at the edge of the festivities. Turns out this was a THC-infused beverage, and within about 30 minutes, I was in a place of total serenity, like a bodhisattva seated in a sacred grove, ready to disperse enlightenment. As I stared placidly into the middle distance, a woman perched upon a love seat next to me and began to make conversation. We talked about a wide variety of topics, from world travel to professional wrestling. Turns out she had just recently attended a local independent event for the Sport of Kings, and she spoke with excitement and wonder at the way the faces fought back against adversity and the heels whipped the crowd into a frothing bloodlust. This woman had lived a fascinating life, and I was quite taken with her stories, her curiosity, her willingness to try new things and explore unfamiliar places. You ever meet someone with that easy, deep charisma where you feel like you could just talk to them for hours and never get tired? This woman had that in spades. But in my ascended state, while one part of my mind was participating in the conversation, another part was floating about 25 feet off the ground, monitoring the situation, evaluating the flow of the conversation, keeping track of whether I'm talking too much or not enough, keeping tabs on whether I thought the woman was engaged or not, just making sure I was being a good citizen, that sort of thing. And this part of me was thinking about how, since I'd moved back to Minnesota in 2023, I'd been saying, this time I'm gonna make friends. This time I'm gonna get out of the house. And this part of me was noticing that I was finally doing the thing I said I was gonna do, making a new friend. And then this part of me had a very strange epiphany. I realized I don't need this. In my office, I have 7 paintings by Edward Hopper. Hopper was an American painter active from the 1920s through the 1960s, operating in and around a movement known as American realism, a movement that attempted to capture and interrogate the social and emotional rhythms of modern American society. If you don't know his name, you probably at least know his most famous painting, Nighthawks from 1942, which depicts a few people patronizing a diner late at night in a deserted part of the city. It's a fine painting, but much like Billy Joel with Piano Man, it's so ubiquitous it's not a piece of art I personally need to seek out. Instead, I have the following hanging on my walls. 11 a.m., 1926, where we watch a nude woman gaze out of an apartment window. Automat, 1927, which depicts a woman drinking coffee alone in a little shop late at night. Night Windows, 1928, which voyeuristically looks through a woman's windows as she makes her nighttime ministrations. Early Sunday morning, 1930, my only Hopper print with no people in it, just a sleepy row of empty storefronts. I found this one at a junk shop for $15. New York movie, 1939, wherein a movie theater worker leans against the wall during a show, seemingly lost in thought. Office in a Small City, 1953, featuring a man gazing contemplatively out his corner office windows. And Chair Car, 1965, where a woman reads quietly on a train. Even if you know nothing about Edward Hopper or his personal philosophy, I would venture to guess that from this small sampling of his work, you can instantly understand the vibe space he was exploring. In a 2020 New Yorker article written after the bullet of the COVID pandemic had decisively exited the barrel, Peter Sheldall calls Hopper the visual bard of American solitude and writes that aloneness is his great theme, symbolizing America, insecure selfhoods in a country that is only abstractly a nation. E pluribus unum, a magnificent ideal, thuds on unum every day throughout the land. Art critic Peter Fuller had this to say: Hopper could, when he wished, say something about those structures of feeling characteristic of modern life. Take Automat of 1926. A woman is seated at a circular table near the door of the automat. The chair in front of her is empty. Beneath the dome of her hat, her eyes are downcast. She has just taken a sip of coffee. Perhaps she is thinking about someone who is not there. Behind her, on the sill, is a bowl of fruit. The round lights of the interior, reflected in the window, run out into the night and are swallowed up by it. She is framed by a great pain of emptiness and silence. She is alone. This is not, of course, a transcription of a given scene or anything like it. The forceful geometry of the painting has been built up through Hopper's self-conscious choices and simplifications. For example, in the way he plays off the circular forms of the woman's hat, coffee cup, table, fruit bowl, and lights against the rectangular shapes of this corner of the room. Above all, Hopper has carefully framed the woman against that potentially engulfing plane of blackness. This is intended to tell us more about her emotional state than about his empirical observations. The older I get, the more fascinated I become by fiction that is true. By that I mean works of art that are not recordings or representations of factual events, and yet still contain an emotional core that is honest and real. If the scene in Spirited Away where Chihiro eats a bite of onigiri and finally lets herself grieve for her lost parents makes me cry like a baby every time, how can you possibly tell me it isn't real? In a similar way, when I turn my gaze to my mini Hoppers, I recognize in them not a historical fact, but an emotional truth. I work from home and often find myself looking out the window thoughtfully. If I go out for lunch by myself, I bring a book and read quietly. Sometimes I just enjoy being out, but not going out, if you catch my meaning. I just want to enjoy a coffee by myself somewhere that isn't home. And perhaps like Hopper himself, there is a streak of voyeurism that runs through me. I find something exhilarating about seeing people in their lives when they don't know they're being seen. I remember some nights in my younger days driving around aimlessly at 2 a.m., dipping into neighborhoods and down streets I'd never been to, seeing all these dark, quiet homes, empty facades for all I knew, and then seeing the odd light on in an upstairs window. Maybe a dark shape slicing through the off-yellow. Maybe the flicker of a TV set causing the shadows to dance. Someone was alive in there. And I was alive out here. We were alive in proximity, but we were not together. The human inside was as unknowable as the unlit home beside it. In his New Yorker article, Sheldahl finds resonance between Hopper's paintings and the films of Alfred Hitchcock. He writes, "In Hitchcock's work, and in Hopper's especially, the unnerving relation of the far to the near is often reversed, and what's mysterious, if not sinister, becomes identical with our point of view. What are we doing here, seeing that? Voyeurism, the saddest excitement may be suggested. The emotional tug of many of Hitchcock's characters and all of Hopper's requires their unawareness of being looked at. To see them is to take on a peculiar responsibility. Hopper often produces the unease even in unpeopled landscapes and views of buildings, as if catching nature and habitation defenselessly exposed in disarray, mundanity, or squalor. The New England coastlines, lighthouses, and sailboats that he painted on summer excursions get off relatively easy. He liked them, but they too feel taken by surprise, depicted from odd angles of vision. No judgment is passed on anyone or anything one way or another. The naked fact of their existence is provocative enough. Why is there something rather than nothing, cosmologists wonder? Hopper is all ears for the answer." Within the world of art criticism, there is much discussion about the subject of a work versus the objects in a work, a dichotomy that sometimes confusingly deviates from our grammatical understanding of subjective and objective. The subject of a piece is the central focus, what it's about, while the objects in a piece are the representations that support the subject, or maybe how it's about it. But we can also talk about subjects and objects through the lens of Martin Buber's concept of I and thou. Buber proposed that human beings, subjects, can adopt two postures towards the things they encounter in life, I, it, and I, thou. When humans decide something is an it, they confer upon it the status of an object, something that exists to be experienced, measured, enjoyed, commented upon, used, consumed. In many ways, this is precisely what voyeurism is, taking up a specific positionality and turning one's consuming I onto the things and people around us, rendering them its to be experienced, mining them for emotions. One can certainly approach Hopper's art from this angle, the way he pulls our gaze into places we weren't invited and presents us figures we need to figure out. In fact, merely having the prints on my walls as decorations for the background of my life is exactly that. Enclosing, framing, hanging for display. And to be clear, this is a perfectly natural posture to take. Buber himself writes that without it, man cannot live, but he who lives with it alone is not a man. And so, according to Buber, we can also adopt a posture of I-thou. If I face a human being as my thou and say the primary word I-thou to him, he is not a thing among things and does not consist of things. I do not experience the man to whom I say thou, but I take my stand in relation to him, in the sanctity of the primary word. Only when I step out of it do I experience him once more. There are times when I look at the subjects of Hopper's paintings and see myself reflected back at me, and I spend time transfixed by that, the way cockatoos sometimes are by mirrors. But other times, I stop seeing those subjects as its and rather as thous, fictitious though they may be, because I realize I'm watching them suspended within the lattice of the its that make up their life. Sometimes, if I try really hard, I stop seeing the subject of Office in a Small City as my reflection, and I start to look at the city, wondering what he's picturing in his mind. Is he looking across the way at a luxury apartment he can't yet afford? Is he looking at a cloudless sky, wishing he was barefoot by the lake instead of wearing a vest in an office building? We can't see his left ring finger. Is he thinking about his wife or his husband? Is he yearning? Is he bored? From one perspective, there is an entire world inside the frame of this painting, and it belongs to me. It's for me to enjoy. From another, there's an entire world outside the frame of this painting, and it means something to this man. It's important to him. In his 1981 essay, Peter Fuller says the following: Edward Hopper, a man as taciturn as the figures in many of his paintings, used to grumble that those who talked about his paintings overdid the loneliness thing. Nonetheless, his best pictures seem to depict the experience of isolation. Hopper's people are lost within themselves even when they're in the presence of others. Hopper did not like being called an American scene painter either, and there it's easier to go along with him. His famous pictures of a man standing by a row of petrol pumps outside a rural filling station, or of shop facades in 7th Avenue, Manhattan on a Sunday morning, are as concerned with a certain structure of feeling as with topography. But that structure of feeling is the loneliness thing. It would, in fact, be hard to say anything convincing about Hopper without stressing the loneliness thing. His paintings are so conspicuously about the vacuity, sadness, futility, emptiness, and yes, experience of alienation on the fringes of the American dream. And to be sure, I think the loneliness thing has a lot to do with Hopper's longevity in the American cultural consciousness. Peter Sheldall's New Yorker essay uses the lens of pandemic lockdowns to talk about this, but those of us living in an era of declining public transit, vanishing third places, and hermetically sealed work-from-home DoorDash ecosystems can see the echoes of Hopper all over our present. It's natural to look at Hopper's subjects and imagine them adrift in some dark night of the soul, staring out towards something they can never have. However, and I don't know if this is me itting or thouing, sometimes I see something different in Hopper's subjects. Sometimes I don't see loneliness. I see solitude. I always find myself coming back to Automat. If I had to choose, I think this is my top Hopper. And so often you hear people describe the woman as sad, lonesome, downcast, or isolated. But I think back to the many times I've popped out for a coffee alone, and though I was sitting by myself, perhaps with my gaze lowered to contemplate my cold brew, I was not lonely. I was perfectly content to be alone in a cafe in the midst of happily chatting patrons. Had Edward Hopper turned his painterly eye towards me, would I have been considered some haunting figure of alienation? I don't know if this is why Hopper grumbled about the focus on the loneliness thing, but I could see him being frustrated that such a deep emotional space could be flattened into any one simple reading. Peter Fuller calls attention to the plane of blackness behind the woman threatening to engulf her, but sometimes when I have eyes to see, I see something a little different. I see a woman who has sought and found refuge from darkness. The world is submerged in night, but the lights have been left on for us. Or, to quote Disco Elysium, in dark times should the stars also go out? When I look at 11 a.m., sure, I see a woman alone, gazing out her window at the world spinning madly by without her, but I also see a woman in her space, nude and comfortable and safe, in total control of these few square inches of earth. In Chair Car, we see a commuter enjoying moments of peace as her train rockets down the tracks, suspended between what's happened and what's coming. And the subject of Office in a Small City has an amazing view from his massive windows. He may be an alienated cog in the corporate machine, but at least he found an oasis of sunlight in a concrete desert. Yes, Edward Hopper is a master at depicting a rapidly atomizing American body, and yes, his subjects often seem to shoulder some sense of alienation or some shadow of grief. But I find Hoppert is most engaging when instead of approaching his art as these subjects are alienated, I instead approach it as these subjects are alienated and yet. Sometimes there is sadness and fear in being alone, but sometimes there is peace and pleasure in solitude. In 2004, I took a red-eye flight to Philadelphia to see the Ring of Honor wrestling show Testing the Limit. I arrived around 5 a.m. and ended up bumming around Center City on foot as the sun rose. And I have this distinct sense memory of the way the street and the alleys smelled, the way the lazily rising sun cast these long shadows along the empty storefronts, the way this soon-to-be bustling street was so quiet. I remember feeling like the city was almost holding its breath. And then, over the course of a half hour, dozens of people began to emerge, hauling crates, sweeping sidewalks, wrangling displays, wiping off the glass, trotting off to do whatever it is people do in the morning. And I'll never forget that beat before the exhale, that little caesura where it was just me and the city suspended in pure relationship. It felt like possibility. It felt like optimism. It felt like hope. The solitude was a clean slate, an empty canvas crying out to be filled, an invitation to be present and grateful and open, and it looked exactly like early morning. At the birthday party, having a lovely conversation with this fascinating woman, when I realized I don't need this, I didn't mean that in a huffy, annoyed way, like, ugh, I don't need this. Instead, what I was reacting to was this pressure I'd been putting on myself. You have to go make friends. You have to go out and build this big social life. You're not being a good lefty if you're not out there shaking hands and kissing babies. I realized I'd been telling myself I needed this robust outside social life when in fact, I was perfectly happy and having my needs met in relative solitude. It's not that I don't want friends, and it's not that I'm not willing to attend social engagements and participate in community. It's not even that I don't take pleasure in doing so. It's simply that I realized that I was allowed to be happy in my solitude. I was allowed to feel satisfied with what I had, even if theoretically I could have more. That epiphany wasn't a sign that I should stop being social. It was a sign that I should stop pressuring myself to want the right things that normal people want. Yes, in the United States, there is a loneliness crisis, and yes, so much of modern American life is designed to alienate and exploit. The system, the machine that consumes us keeps us isolated so we can't come together and gum up the works. But even so, even knowing that this gulf I sometimes find myself in was a cage designed to bind me, I can't help but find beauty hiding in the stillness. I can't deny the pleasure I feel late at night, just me and the universe suspended in pure relationship. And I can't ignore the way the stars wink at me from the inky deep, as if we were sharing a secret.